This text of social dominance was published less than 15 years ago, and already it has become one of the most influential and highly cited theories in social psychology. The theory absolutely shook the world of prejudice in psychology because before Jim, no psychologist had come up with a theory about prejudice as ambitious or far-reaching in scope. First, his theory considers the universal processes of prejudice and intergroup relations that exist throughout all societies and has existed throughout all of history. Second, it considers data and ideas from interdisciplinary sources, borrowing from sociology, political science, biology, and especially anthropology and evolutionary theory. Jim reaches back to old Marxist ideas about social hierarchies, about group-based power, and about forces of oppression. But unlike Marx, Jim actually gets human nature right and has no illusions about the ability of oppressed masses to change their circumstances. You understand why revolutions are the great exception and not the rule, why most subordinate people simply accept their lot in life. You understand why and how much of what appears to be social progress in terms of the improvement of racial, ethnic, and religious groups and women is often an illusion. The ideas behind social dominance theory are often hard to swallow, and indeed for many years I resisted these ideas. But step outside of the optimism of the United States and immerse yourself in the world, as I did when I took my first academic position at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon and witnessed firsthand the bombed-out buildings and refugee camps. And you will quickly see the relevance and immediacy and the truth of these great ideas. Jim's thinking, in my opinion, is helping to snap psychologists out of their foggy optimism to reveal the true underbelly of how prejudice and oppression operates in the world. I predict that 100 years from now, despite the passing of many ideas and theories of prejudice, his theory of social dominance will endure as one of the lasting classics in the field. It's probably clear by now why I'm so excited about having Jim speak here today. He's been not only a great thinker in a field I care so passionately about, but he's a man who, without even realizing it, has been a huge mentor to me. No one has influenced my thinking and approach to the science of prejudice as much as Jim has. He's my intellectual hero. So with these words, I present to you Professor Jim Sidanius.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank NYUAD Institute for inviting me here, and especially PJ for that overly positive introduction. I myself have a history in the American civil rights movement between the mid-1960s and very early 1970s. And concluded after engaging in many years of activity in this activism, that while there had been some progress made, things had changed. The ultimate result of the American civil rights movement was failure. And the reason I say that is because we were not interested in attenuating the problems of racism and discrimination, but we're interested in actually eliminating these phenomena. And it's clear to anyone who pays any attention to contemporary social events that that has not been achieved. Race, gender, national origin, religion, sectarian membership still play a very decisive role in what happens to people in their lives. So as a result of this failure, I, together with Felicia Prado, decided to rethink the extant theories and positions concerning discrimination and prejudice. And to do this, we developed this notion called social dominance theory. One of the basic observations of this model we've developed is that human social systems seem to be structured as group-based hierarchies. And regardless of what society you're talking about or what historical epoch you're talking about, some societies are more egalitarian than others, but that which they share in common all is that they are all, to one degree or another, organized as group-based social hierarchy, with one dominant group at the top of the social system and one or a number of subordinate groups at the bottom. Given the fact that we notice sort of the universal nature of group-based social hierarchy, we then make two assumptions. One being that social systems are predisposed to be organized as group-based social hierarchies, and two, that most forms of social oppression that we're used to, like racism, slavery, sexism, nationalism, classism, sectarianism, are really simply special instantiations of the tendency for human societies to organize themselves as group-based social hierarchies. And the primary goals of social dominance theory are really to try to understand and identify the precise multi-layered mechanisms responsible for the creation, maintenance, and recreation of group-based social hierarchy. And the processes responsible for this are multi-leveled. They exist as a function of individual differences and personality between individuals, situational constraints, social and group identities, legitimizing social ideologies, and what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about here tonight are social institutions, the behavior of social institutions and how they produce and maintain group-based social hierarchy. This yellow down here simply means that SDT, social dominance theory, is not a personality theory of prejudice or discrimination. It incorporates personality theory together with other notions in the social sciences and physical sciences. We argue that the degree to which societies are organized as group-based social hierarchies is really the result of the net effect of two conflicting social agents or social forces. The first set of social forces producing higher and greater degrees of social inequality are what we call hierarchy-enhancing social agents. Counter to these, and directly contradicting these kinds of hierarchy-enhancing forces, we argue that there are an almost equally strong set of forces, social agents, which have the effect of attenuating social inequality and creating greater and greater levels of equality rather than inequality. And these hierarchy-enhancing he and hierarchy-attenuating ha agents can be one of any number of phenomena, such as, for example, social political ideologies. If we take example of some he ideologies, there would be things like fascism, racism, sexism, classism, and capitalism, or high ideologies, the universal rights of man and notions in social democracy. Or these social agents can be social stereotypes, social customs, and the behavior of social institutions. And it's this institutional level we're going to concentrate on, as I said, tonight. Examples of hierarchy-enhancing social institutions are things like internal security forces, the Stasi or the FBI, the KGB, SAVAK, Vlak Plus, Gestapo, and Al-Mukhtabarat, I think that's pronounced. Stasi, of course, was the secret police in East Germany. SAVAK was the secret police in Iran during the Shah of Iran's reign. And the Vlak Plus, does anybody know what Vlak Plus was? It was the secret police in South Africa under the apartheid regime. Another set of hierarchy-enhancing forces or institutions are semi-official and unofficial terror organizations like death squads, vigilantes, and militias. And thirdly, we have examples of hierarchy-enhancing institutions such as profit-maximizing financial and corporate organizations. Examples of hierarchy-attenuating social institutions are things like civil rights and civil liberties organizations, charities, public defender's office, etc. So I have four basic goals with this talk. The first goal is to argue that intergroup violence and terror are not unusual phenomena, but are normal components of intergroup discourse, in part designed and maintained to establish and maintain group-based social inequality and intergroup dominance. Secondly, I'm going to argue that under normal circumstances, this intergroup violence and terror are not only carried out by individuals, but even more importantly, they're carried out by institutions, such as the criminal justice system and the internal security systems. Third, I'm going to argue that under normal circumstances, there's going to be a matching or congruency between the hierarchical behavior and behavioral predisposition of individuals and the hierarchical character of those social institutions and social roles in which people function. We call this the hierarchy congruence hypothesis. And lastly, I'm going to suggest that there are at least 4 mechanisms which are responsible for the matching of individuals with the appropriate hierarchical attitudes and behavioral predispositions to the appropriate social roles. So let's take the criminal justice system as a form of institutional terror. Keeping in mind that the state is in all societies disproportionately controlled by members of dominant groups, we can therefore look at the violence exercised by the state, including the criminal justice system, as a form of group-based aggression by dominance against subordinates. In other words, in part, the activities of the criminal justice system is a form of group-based terror. And by saying that, I'm not just engaging in hyperbole, but I'm quite serious about it. If we take the definition of what terrorism is, it's not simply the activities of a group of ruffians blowing up buildings and cafes and shooting people, but it can be generally defined as violence committed or threatened by a group to intimidate or coerce a population. And that can be exercised by groups of individuals as well as the state and sub-state actors. To give you an example of what I mean by this, we can go back into the depths of American history, and there is an interesting data file called the ESPY file, which looks at 13,923 death sentences carried out in the United States between 1608 and 1991. And what we did, my colleagues and I, we went through this database and divided up the forms of execution into 3 categories. The first category is relatively humane executions, things like asphyxiation, shooting, and lethal injection, or moderately brutal forms of execution like hanging and electrocution, and very brutal forms of execution such as crushing, breaking on the wheel, burning, hanging in chains, and bludgeoning. Does anybody know what breaking on the wheel is? Yes, sir. That's right. You put a human body in a large wagon wheel, and it doesn't generally fit very well on a large wagon wheel, and you break the person's arms and legs so that they fit around this wagon wheel, and you leave them there in agony to die. So what we decided to do was to see whether or not there was a relationship between ethnic group membership and the likelihood of being executed in mild and humane, moderately brutal, or very brutal forms of execution. And we found the following. For humane forms of execution, over these 13,000 cases of executed prisoners, about 61% of them were used against Euro-Americans, the high-status group in the United States, and only 39 used against African Americans. For the moderately brutal forms of execution, it was about 50-50. And for the very brutal forms of execution, 88% and change were used against African American and not Euro-American prisoners. Informal forms of terror, not carried out by the state, but by sub-state actors. One example of this is lynching in the United States between 1859 and 1962, and this is a moderate estimate of how many lynchings were carried out. We estimate approximately 5,000 lynchings were carried out. But one of the characteristics of this form of execution is it's often associated with extreme forms of brutality and sadism, such as cutting off fingers and extremities, castration, and burning alive. As one example of this form of lynching, we have a lynching carried out in 1919 of William Brown in Douglas County, Nebraska, where this person was castrated and then burnt alive. These incidents of the either informal or formal or state-controlled forms of terror are also readily observable in contemporary American life and contemporary life in all modern societies. One example of this is done by an experiment done by Jennifer Eberhardt, Paul Davies and colleagues, looking at the likelihood of African American prisoners being murdered or executed by the state, depending upon the ethnicity of the victim of homicide and the race stereotypicality of the perpetrator. And so what was done is they collected an extensive database compiled by Baldus et al., looking at more than 600 death-eligible cases from Philadelphia. And they control for things like the aggravating circumstances, the mitigating circumstances, the severity of the murder, defendant's socioeconomic status, and the victim's economic status, et cetera, and made the following kinds of position in the research. They made a distinction between race prototypical African American, this is the dark fellow on the right, and non-race prototypical persons or African Americans, this is the guy on the left. And the question was, is the likelihood of being executed, especially if it's a member of a dominant group, ethnic group, a function of whether you are race stereotypical or non-race stereotypical? And let's start, and these are the results, and we'll start with the bottom. For black defendants accused of murdering black victims, it made no difference whether the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, was less prototypical or more prototypical of an African American face. It made no difference. However, when the black defendant was accused of murdering a white defendant, then you see that there's a much larger chance of being given the death penalty if you are a race stereotypical, a typical African American perpetrator. So there is the severity of punishment is also going to depend not simply on your ethnic status, but who it is that you commit violence against. One consequence of this is of the criminal justice system being an instrument of social terror is that there should be disproportionate rates of imprisonment as a function of this activity of the social state. And we can see some rough evidence of that in this data collected by the federal government. And what it shows is that about 32% of African American males between the ages of 18 and 32 are in prison, either in prison, in jail, wanted for arrest, or waiting trial. 17% of Latino American males, as opposed to approximately 6% of Euro-American males. So it has the effect of imprisoning members of subordinate groups at ordinarily high rates. This is not simply restricted to the United States and something which is an American phenomena. We're going to suggest to you that this is really a universal phenomenon. So for instance, here are data collected by the OECD of a number of different European countries, going from Spain down to England. This the second column here shows us the number of foreign inmates in prisons in these various countries. This third column here, shows us the proportion of foreigners who are imprisoned. And in this last column here, or next to the last column, we have the proportion of foreigners in proportion to their, in the total population. If we then look at the probability of being imprisoned, we see that there is that immigrants are imprisoned at 11 times the rate as native-born citizens of Spain and Italy and Greece. What I'd like to bring your attention to is that the United States is not an outlier here. It's sort of in the middle of the distribution. It's not particularly liberal in its imprisonment rates and not particularly oppressive compared to these other states. To further explore this notion, one of my graduate students and I did a study where we used the 50 states of the United States as the unit of analysis, and then tried to examine the degree to which there is a relationship between the degree to which a state is hierarchically organized and the likelihood that that state will use the death penalty in general. And what we found is that even after accounting for things like violent crime, conservatism of the state, the income level, proportion of whites, the number of white victims, and the old Confederacy, the degree to which that state was hierarchically structured had a major effect and a significant effect on whether that state was likely to use the death penalty. And the way in which we operationalized social hierarchy was looking at the Gini index. One index is looking at the income inequality in the state, the underrepresentation of women in the state parliament, and the underrepresentation of African Americans in the state parliament. And these three factors, indices, constitute what we call social hierarchy, which turns out to be strongly related to the probability of the state putting people to death. We replicated this study looking at countries of the world. We looked at 147 countries, again, tried to control for as many different variables as we could, and here we only were able to operationalize social equality as the degree of income inequality. And once again, net of these other factors, the more unequal the state is structured, the more likely that national state is to use the death penalty. So if the police and criminal justice system have these hierarchy-enhancing functions that we assume that they're going to have, then subordinates should have higher levels of fear of the state and the instruments of the state. Because without this fear, then there would be no point in terrorizing the population or the subordinate population if it had no effect. To see whether or not this does have an effect, we did a very simple study many years ago and asked a random sample of Los Angelinos the degree to which they were afraid of the Los Angeles Police Department, the LAPD, as a function of race and as a function of class. And what we did was look first at the racial differences in experienced fear of the police. And we ordered these by the status of the ethnic group. So whites in the United States have the highest level of status, then comes Asian Americans here, Latino Americans here, and African Americans. Controlling for nothing, what we see is the lower one's ethnic status, the greater one's fear is of the police. But this control for nothing, not educational levels or gender or SAS or the area in which one lived. Once we put in these controls, we found the following relationships. There were still systematic differences between the experienced fear of members of the community as a function of their ethnic status in the community. We also did the same thing as a function of the socioeconomic status, so the income level of the citizens. So we divided the large sample into 3 categories of poor, middle class, and wealthy, and discovered, not surprisingly, that it was the poor who were substantially more afraid of the police than either the middle class or the wealthy. And those results even held up when controlling for race. Okay? So these differences are independent of any effect of race. Harsh criminal sanctions and SDO. SDO being an individual difference dimension, measuring the degree to which people approve of and support group-based social hierarchy and domination of groups in society in general. And we argue here that if our reasoning is correct, we should expect to find that a relationship between harsh criminal sanctions and the degree to which citizens in that state would like to establish and maintain group-based inequality in the society. And there are 2 major ideologies which have been discovered to be related to the degree to which people support harsh criminal sanctions in the law. One of those 2 reasons is deterrence. People feeling that if the sanctions are harsh and unyielding, that will deter and discourage other people from committing crimes. And there are 2 forms of this deterrence: general deterrence and specific deterrence, or what we call incapacitation. Another major reason for supporting harsh criminal sanctions is for reasons of retribution or just deserts. Harsh crimes deserved harsh punishments. So we decided to see whether or not these ideologies of criminal deterrence and retribution were related to, 1, support for harsh criminal sanctions, and 2, support for social inequality and dominance. And we operationalize general deterrence by support of the death penalty, by retribution, like questions such as those who hurt others deserve to be hurt in return. We also measured social dominance orientation, or the degree to which people would like to maintain and establish group-based inequality. And we have a 16-item attitude questionnaire called the SDO scale, which has questions like this. To get ahead, it's sometimes necessary to step on other groups, or inferior groups should stay in their place, or superior groups should dominate inferior groups, or all groups should be given an equal chance in life. This is the obverse of the top 3. So, these are the measures we used. Looked at general punitiveness, support for the death penalty, and support for lethal terror. And the general framework for this is to say support for harsh sanctions will, in fact, be related to beliefs in general deterrence, specific deterrence, and retribution. We do not dispute that. But what we are arguing is that these ideologies motivating harsh sanctions are not exogenous. They're not independent of the desire to maintain and establish inequality in society. That is to say, they will be in turn related to higher levels of social dominance orientation. And so we looked at this model with respect to 3 different dependent variables of forms of harsh criminal sanctions. One is general punitiveness, and we saw these numbers indicate the degree of net relationship between each of the boxes and general punitiveness. And here we were looking at the degree to which SDO, or the desire to maintain and establish dominance, had an effect on general punitiveness, not only directly, which it does, but also indirectly by increasing levels of these various forms of criminal justice ideologies. The same thing was found with support for the death penalty. That is to say, support for the death penalty is proximately caused by these 3 forms of criminal justice ideology support, which in turn are supported by the desire to establish and maintain group inequality. And lastly, we found similar kinds of indirect supports, in this case, an indirect mediation from SDO to specific deterrence to support for lethal terror. So there's some experimental or statistical evidence in support of this. What about the hierarchy incongruence hypothesis and individual predispositions in institutional behavior? Well, this hypothesis says that if hierarchy enhancing and hierarchy attenuating institutions and organizations function in the manner that we're positing that they function in, then these organizations should be disproportionately staffed by people with the appropriate personalities and behavioral predispositions and social values. In other words, he organizations should be disproportionately staffed by people with high levels of social dominance orientation, and Ha organizations should be disproportionately staffed by people with low levels of social dominance orientation. So let's take some examples of this actually happening. Here we did a study on Los Angeles residents, and we looked at 4 categories of individuals. Public defenders are those who defend indigent and poor defendants in the criminal justice system by giving them free legal advice. These are the warm and fuzzies of our story. University students who are somewhat liberal in these domains. Jurors, which in this group represented a random sample of people called to jury duty in Los Angeles County. It's a random sample of the population. And police officers are Genghis Khans of the story. What we looked at were levels of social dominance orientation, or the degree to which people in these 4 categories wanted to establish and maintain group-based inequality and dominance. And not surprisingly, those who were least supportive of dominance of one group over another were the warm and fuzzies of our story, the public defenders, followed by university students, followed by a random sample of the population, and then basically followed by nobody. You know, you have to take a huge leap to get to the police. However, these data do not control for other kinds of factors, like education levels, gender, socioeconomic status of various kinds. So putting in these controls, you see the results in the red bar. So what I would like to point out is that even though students not controlling for anything seem to have lower levels of social dominance orientation than a random sample of adults, once we put in controls for education, age, SES, social economic status, the difference between university students and jurors disappears. This is no longer statistically significant, that difference. But there was nothing we could do to get rid of the difference between the Genghis Khans on the one hand and the public defenders on the other. The matching process. How is it the case, how does it happen that there is this matching between people's individual proclivities, ideological orientations, and the social roles that they inhabit. And we argue that there are at least 4 different mechanisms which are responsible for this. One of them is self-selection. People with prior, very dominance-oriented attitudes are going to be attracted disproportionately to hierarchy-enhancing institutions. The second mechanism is institutional selection. When institutions are choosing people to hire into various roles, they're going to attend to the degree to which the overall social values of the prospective personnel is consistent with the institution's purposes. Thirdly, once you are in an institutional role, regardless of how you got there, there'll be a tendency for your attitudes to change to be consistent with the people around you and to be consistent with the roles of that institution. And lastly, there'll be differential rewards and retention processes. Those people who have social values, in this case, social dominance orientation, which is consistent with the role of the institution they're in, they're going to be disproportionately rewarded by that institution. And people whose attitudes are out of sync with the institution's goals will be disproportionately punished. Those are the predictions. What about the empirical evidence? The first evidence I'm going to show you deals with the self-selection process. And this is an old study we did with the university students at UCLA. And we simply looked at the degree to which they found various careers attractive and related that to their level of social dominance orientation. So for instance, the question was, please indicate how attractive you find each of the careers. And we start out with 4 he careers: working as a lawyer for the government prosecuting crime, working to enforce the law and prevent crime, working with the FBI and other national police, working to improve the profits of business. Okay? So those are he professions. Our ha professions are things like working as a civil rights lawyer for those discriminated against, working as a lawyer defending those unable to afford their own lawyer, working as an advocate for human rights, and working to improve the welfare of the poor, the ill, and the elderly. Having done these ratings, the next job in the research was to see whether or not students' social dominance orientation was related to the attractiveness or the unattractiveness of these various professions. And the data were consistent with expectations. If we look at the he careers, we found that the more attractive the students found those careers upon graduation and becoming big people, the higher their SDO levels were. There was a positive association between attractiveness of the he careers and SDO, net of things like political conservatism. But the numbers were even more impressive when we looked at the degree to which there was a negative relationship between the attractiveness of ha careers and SDO. And here we found that the higher the students' SDO, the less attractive they found things like civil rights work, working for the poor, human rights work, and improving the conditions of the poor and the elderly. That is to say, these careers for high social dominance individuals were anathema. They really disliked them and didn't want to have anything to do with them. We found the same general tendency in a 4-year panel study where we followed university students from the time they entered the university as freshmen, and we tested them each year until they graduated over a 4-year period and measured their levels of anti-egalitarianism and their relative preference for he careers versus ha careers after graduation, and found a significant relationship in the freshman year, in the sophomore year, in the 3rd year, and not quite for the 4th year. Right? So the more non-egalitarian or anti-egalitarian the students were, the more attractive they found he versus ha careers. So that was the first mechanism making for this association between values and the character of the institutions that people work in. The second one is institutional selection. And this is can be exemplified by a series of studies we did as to whether he-ness or ha-ness of employment history is associated with the he-ness or ha-ness of being placed in a given job. So what we did was we looked at applicants. This was a study where respondent subjects were told to behave as if they were human relations, human resource people, or making hiring decisions. And we gave he and ha job histories. And one job history has the following kind of description. Had an experience as a camp counselor at a selective private camp for elite youngsters like in Lake Tahoe, and was co-founder and president of Capital Operations, a student club promoting free enterprise in Eastern Europe and Russia. What kind of employment history is this? He or ha? He, okay? Or an employment history, worked as a camp counselor for a Head Start program and was co-founder and president of Lifesavers, a student club promoting international legislation to protect the rainforests and their inhabitants. This is clearly a ha job history. What about the kind of job people are going in? What we did was control for the specific job and simply manipulated how that job was described. So here's a job for a paralegal aide, and this is the job description. And looking at, what does it say? Needs an assistant to lawyers whose client base consists of recent immigrants, lower income families, and independent minors. Duties include assisting lawyers in directing clients to appropriate agencies and assisting clients in completing forms. Also, legal assistants will keep abreast and advise attorneys and clients on new immigration regulations. Occasional delivery of papers to the clients. What kind of a job description is this? Ha. As opposed to the same job, a paralegal aide, but this time it was described as consisting of the following jobs. Finney and Sutton and Laura, attorneys at law, legal assistants needed for growing firms specializing in workers' compensation fraud cases. Last year, we saved California companies over $1 million by reducing the amount of workers' compensation they were required to pay, et cetera. Okay? So the question was, is the he-ness or ha-ness of somebody's employment history related to the likelihood that they will be employed or hired to go in a specific kind of job? And that's exactly what the data show. For ha jobs, when people were trying to decide who to hire for which job, they attended to the employment history of the person, so that ha jobs are most likely to be staffed by people with ha job histories. And similarly, people employed or hired to do he jobs were those people who are disproportionately likely to have he job histories. So he-ness or ha-ness is something that people seem to implicitly pay attention to when they're making hiring decisions. By the way, besides high and low social dominance orientation as differentiating people in ha jobs from he jobs, what other factor, demographic factor, would you imagine would be associated with this? For ha jobs, what kind of character, what kind of person are we going to hire for this job? Women, all right? Women are disproportionately hired for ha jobs, and men disproportionately hired for he jobs. The third mechanism, institutional socialization. We're going to go back to an early study done by Tehan in 1975, looking at the attitudes of white police officers at the time of their entry into the police academy over an 18-month period as they were being trained in the police academy. And what the data showed was, what Tehan found, was that the longer the police cadets were being trained, the greater their exposure to police culture, the more hostile their attitudes were, the more ethnocentric they became, and the more racist they became to African Americans. This is before they actually hit the street. This is simply through a process of training. Similar results were found in the year 2000 by one of my French colleagues, Serge Guimond, and he was looking at attitudes about foreign immigrants to Canada as a function of exposure to the Canadian military. And in this example, the lower the number, the less positive the recruit is to foreign immigrants. And what he found was the following. After 4 years, Canadian military officers were less positively disposed to foreign immigrants than they were in their first year. Okay. So the longer their exposure, the more hostile they were becoming to foreign immigrants. But that's not the real beauty of this data. The real beauty of this data says that that relationship, that is to say, long-time exposure to the Canadian military being associated with levels of racism and xenophobia, was also moderated by, or controlled by, the degree to which you identified with your role as a military officer. So for those military officers who strongly identified, who really grooved on their role as Canadian military people, they showed the most marked increase in negative attitudes towards the foreign immigrants. Okay? The most strongly they identified with the role, the bigger this effect was. Fourth mechanism, differential rewards and differential attribution. Now, previous research has shown that members of he organizations who behave in an especially oppressive manner towards subordinates will tend to be disproportionately rewarded. And to put some meat on the bones of this hypothesis, we looked at a study done way back in 1976 by Lightland and Sedlacek, which was a study of university campus officers, police officers. And what they found is that the more racially biased the police officers were, the more positive their performance evaluations were by their supervisors. Okay? High levels of racism associated with good feedback from their supervisors. Another example of this was done in a study by Paul Chevigny in 1995, and looking at the behavior of police departments across 5 countries of the Americas, including the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Jamaica, and Mexico. And what Chevigny found was that, among other things, police terror against subordinates is relatively common and low risk. But more importantly, not only were police officers generally not sanctioned for behaving in an especially brutal manner against subordinate members of the society, but they were often rewarded for this behavior. That is to say, the more they brutalized subordinate members of the society, the more commendations they got, the more positive their evaluations of their supervisors was. We can see similar findings in a follow-up study resulting from the Rodney King police beating. I think most of you probably have heard of Rodney King. It was an African-American motorist in Los Angeles who was chased for speeding by police officers. He finally stopped. They took him out of the car and almost beat him to death. Okay. This went to trial. The officers were accused of assault and later acquitted by a nearly all-white jury, which then sparked the largest riot uprising in American history, with hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, and several people killed. And after this event, the government of Los Angeles decided to appoint a commission to study cases of police abuse and brutality against citizens. And they looked at 3,419 cases of complaints against the police by the citizens between 1986 and 1990. And what they discovered was, of those 3,419 cases, 97 of them were unsustained. They were simply dismissed as not having any grounds to go further. Only 3% of them, over 3% of these cases, were found to be sustained, to have some merit. Of those 3%, only 7.6% of the complaints resulted in the dismissal of the police officer. Now let's put this together. You're a citizen, you're a low-status citizen of Los Angeles, you're beaten up by the police, you go to the police, the authorities, and make a complaint. What's the likelihood that that complaint is going to lead to dismissal of the officer? It's essentially zero, right? It's 3% of 7.6%. In other words, it's not going to happen. Okay? Police officers can do this with near impunity. But the study gets more interesting in that. Not only can they exercise in brutality against subordinate members of the community with near impunity, they also tend to be rewarded for it. So how do we find this out? Well, what the Christopher Commission did was look at the cases of those 44 officers of the LAPD who had the largest number of complaints for brutality and unjust treatment on the part of citizens. And what they discovered was it was exactly these 44 officers whose supervisors were most optimistic about their chances. It was these officers who got the best performance recommendations by their supervisors. In other words, these officers were in fact rewarded for this kind of behavior. So the impression seems to be that the more you behave consistently with the role that you're in, the more you're going to be rewarded. And we took this idea and decided to bring it in to the university campus environment. And we looked at the relationship between levels of racism of students and their majors. They were ha majors or he majors, and decided to make the following distinctions. We could divide the students with low racism scores or high racism scores and see whether or not they were in he or ha majors. Now what should happen is the following. We could see that students with low racism scores who were ha majors were what we're going to call congruence. That is to say, there's a consistency between their social attitudes and the subjects that they're studying. They're congruence. So low racism ha majors and high racism he majors, those are also congruent people. Incongruent students would be those students with, let's say, low levels of racism in he majors or high levels of racism in ha majors. Now looking at this quadrant, we would argue that the people who are most congruent, their racial attitudes being in sync with the professions they're preparing for, these people along the diagonal here, these people should get rewarded by the institution at a higher rate than the people who are incongruent. And how does a university reward its students? Grades, right? That's the currency of reward on the university campus. So the hypothesis was that these students would have significantly higher grades than the students on the off diagonals. Okay? So first we're going to go through how we define these he and ha majors. The ha majors are things like American studies, anthropology, Asian studies, ethnic studies, studies of Mexican Americans, Latin American studies, etc. What would make these majors ha majors? What do they have in common? They're all about studies of low power, low status individuals. Okay? Mexicans, African Americans, special education, these are people who are sick or have special education needs, nursing and social work. These are the work with the poor, the downtrodden, so to speak. What about the HA majors at an American university? Things like accounting, advertising, economics, finance, general business, management, and marketing administration. And what these things have in common, they are all one way or another associated with business and capitalism, okay, and the accrual of wealth. So we said, okay, are Ha's and he's really different on racial attitudes? That's the first thing we need to establish. If there are no racial differences between these categories, then our entire line of reasoning falls apart. So we looked at the he's, this is their race, this is classical racism. The intermediate students who are classified neither as he or ha's and are warm and fuzzies. And consistent with expectations, he's were significantly more racist than intermediates, who were more racist than the ha's. These were statistically significant differences. Now, having established that, we need to find out whether being congruent or incongruent is associated with differential reward. And what this chart shows here, on the x-axis here, we have the student's average GPA, and this is 2.0, that's a relatively poor GPA. This is a relatively high GPA, 3.5 to 4. And this is the proportion of people who are he's and ha's getting various kinds of GPAs. So for example, here, students who are doing very poorly, they tend to be disproportionately incongruent. Their racial attitudes are out of sync with the majors that they're in. Okay? Only 26% of them are congruent. But as you go up the academic achievement ladder, what you find is that the proportion of congruent students dominates the proportion of incongruent students. In other words, the greater if there's a match between your racial attitudes and the major that you're studying, you're going to be rewarded by higher grades. This study was done at the University of Texas with a sample of about 5,000 students. We replicated it at UCLA with a sample of a panel sample of about 2,000 students, following the students through their careers. So we followed them from freshman, sophomore, junior to senior year to see, on this axis here, we have the actual GPA. This is done more appropriately, where the dependent variable is on the y-axis. And what we find is no significant relationship among freshmen, no significant relationship between their grades and the major that they have, or the subjects that they're studying. And this is not surprising, because freshman university students don't really have majors yet. They haven't declared. But among those students who have declared, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, we find out that congruent students have substantially higher GPA levels than incongruent students, both in the sophomore, junior, and senior year. I'll skip this. So the conclusions, what are we saying? Well, basically, we're arguing that rather than being regarded as extraordinary events, intergroup violence and terror are chronic, if low-level aspects of intergroup discourse, even in so-called democratic societies. Secondly, under normal circumstances, this intergroup violence and terror are enacted by hierarchy-enhancing social institutions, such as the criminal justice system, and in part function to create and maintain hierarchical intergroup relations. I'd like to add a caveat here. We're not suggesting that the only purpose of the criminal justice system and security systems is to maintain group-based hierarchy. That would be a silly thing to say. What we are suggesting is that one of the functions of these institutions is to maintain the nature of group-based inequality. Third, helping to ensure the enactment of this institutional violence, personnel with the appropriate behavioral predispositions, for example, high levels of SDO, will tend to be disproportionately allocated to hierarchy-enhancing social roles. In other words, we found support for the hierarchy congruence hypothesis. And lastly, we're going to argue and would suggest that the allocation of people to the appropriate social roles will be achieved by one of four mechanisms. All four mechanisms in one degree or another: self-selection, institutional selection, institutional socialization, and differential reward and retention. What don't we know yet? Well, one of the things we don't know is the precise mechanisms which are responsible for turning congruence, for leading to higher levels of success, institutional success, than compared with incongruence. Exactly how does that take place? Exactly what are the mechanisms which turns congruency into success? It could be due to value consistency with peers and supervisors, so that the greater the similarity between the new recruits' social attitudes and the supervisor's social attitudes, the more successful that recruit is likely to be. That's one possibility. A second possibility is that congruents are more interested and highly motivated in the performance of their social roles. They're turned on more by them. That could be what's driving this. Or, in a related fashion, not only are congruents more interested, but they might also have superior social skills and talents which enable them to be relatively more successful. In other words, racist police officers might be more successful police officers than warm and fuzzy police officers. That's a possibility. Another thing we don't know is whether or not congruents have lower levels of job attrition. So what we should expect to find is, everything else being equal, the more congruent you are in your social role, the less likely you are either to be fired or to quit voluntarily. We haven't actually studied this yet and need to do it. And lastly, we need to decide and find out whether congruence will in fact make more and more extreme ha or he social allocations and the actual pursuance of their roles. That is to say, he personnel should be making more he decisions in their jobs, and ha personnel more ha decisions in their jobs. And all of these, and both of these tendencies should help to maintain a balance between hierarchy and equality. And at that point, I think I'll stop. Thank you.
My question was about social dominance orientation, because to me it sounds like somebody who's socially dominant orientated has respect for purity and authority and in-group loyalty. I was just wondering, what's the difference between SDO and, say, classical conservatism? Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the case that not all, the empirical relationship between classical conservatism and SDO is about 0.30. So they're positively associated, but they're not, it's not a tautology. It's not as if the core of conservative belief systems is the domination of weak groups over strong groups. One could say that the core of conservative belief is endorsement of competition, of free market capitalism, and neoliberal economic views. So it's not necessarily, they'll be related to dominance orientation, but it's not the same thing. Neither is SDO the same thing or synonymous with authoritarianism, which is sort of adherence to in-group norms and dislike of and distrust of people who violate in-group norms. socially dominating people are not so much interested in norms as they are interested in relationships of superiority and inferiority, regardless of what means they use to achieve that. So they're not the same thing.
Have you or could you test the relative persistence of the kind of personality he factor as opposed to the institutional imposition of and reinforcement of he proclivities? And what I'm really looking at is the extent to which education that is predominantly ha or institutions that are predominantly ha can in fact over time change the he to a ha. And to what extent in fact, even though there would be incongruence at the beginning, and therefore between the he person coming in and the high institution, to what extent would that incongruence lead to maybe failure or lack of involvement, lack of identity, lack of progress at first, be able to overcome and change the he to the ha, which of course is what education, or at least what NYUAD education is trying to do.
Well, I mean, there is some evidence of that. The longer people are exposed to ha institutions, the more likely they are to move into ha directions. We see that in educational data, such that university students are relatively conservative when they enter university, and as they go through the university training, they become more and more tolerant of one another and more liberal. That does happen. But it's also the case that greater one's exposure to he institutions, the more intolerant and dominance-oriented you're becoming. So you've got both of these forces interacting with one another and contradicting one another. And we argue that it's the contradiction of these two sets of ha forces and he forces that helps to maintain the relative stability of a social system at any given time, because there are not these violent swings in he-ness and ha-ness in society for the most part.
Thank you. What I would like to ask is, well, I must say I'm somewhat surprised at some of the evidence that you have provided, and there was one of the continuing existence of racism, especially in institutionalized or institutions, societal institutions, because surely there's been some improvement in America, certainly, to the point where we have actually elected an African American as president of the United States. It seems to me that, certainly speaking as an Asian American, I can definitely tell you there are much more opportunities that exist today for African Americans in high-profile positions, like in government and in entertainment, than exists for Asian Americans, for that matter. What can you account for this? For what?
As you recall, in my initial remarks, I commented on the fact that there has been progress made in this regard in the civil rights movement as a result of the civil rights movement. But the problem I have, and the reason why we needed to think more deeply about this, is that discrimination is still there. It can still be found. It still makes a difference in people's lives. So that if you're stopped by the police, if you're an African American, you're more likely to be stopped, you're more likely to be charged. Once charged, you're more likely to be found guilty of a crime, you're more likely to spend more time in prison, etc., everything else being equal. You're less likely to be rented houses or apartments in certain neighborhoods. You're less likely to be hired for jobs, and we've shown this in experimental evidence. It's not just restricted to African Americans in the United States. We find this kind of discriminatory behavior across all social systems, whether it be Mexicans and Indians in Mexico, or Turkish immigrants in Germany, or people from the Maghreb in France, or Palestinians in Israel. It's a universal phenomenon. And it can change in the degree of hierarchy. There's no question about the fact that the United States has become a more egalitarian society compared to, let's say, 1940 or 1930. But does not argue that there is not substantial and significant residual intolerance, racism, and hierarchy. That has not gone away. It's simply attenuated slightly. And my more optimistic colleagues might argue that that attenuation will continue indefinitely. And we see no signs in our data or looking through human history of that actually happening, of there only being a unidirectional movement in the degree of social inequality. Sometimes it gets less, sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse. It sort of moves around. What we don't know yet and don't have a good theory for is what factors account for the increase in social equality in a given society at a given time, or changes in that hierarchy over time. We don't have a good answer for that. But we stick by our initial observation that even the United States, even Sweden, of which I'm a citizen, which is the most egalitarian society in the world, or among the most, still has problems of sexism and racism and classism. And it's still a hierarchical society. It's just a little softer in its manifestation.
Looking at America still, John McWhorter and others argue that the main driving force between distrust of police by blacks, or the antagonism between blacks and the police, is the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, which obviously is itself a result of social, it's a policy that comes out of social dominance orientation. But to what extent do you think, if there was reform and war on drugs, that the relationship could improve? To what extent is it policy, and to what extent is it just inherent?
Well, we would imagine that if they were to get rid of this tendency to imprison such large numbers of African American and Latino American citizens, the relationship between these communities and the police department would probably get a little better. But it wouldn't be very positive in absolute terms, because we're arguing that one of the roles of the police is to control subordinate populations disproportionately. So, for instance, the stop and frisk policy in New York City is an example of that, where Latino and African American young people can be stopped at any time, made to lie prone on the ground or searched, and treated generally with not a great deal of respect. And the idea is that that connection, that interchange between the police officer and the citizen is really, in part, functions to reinforce this notion that I am in control of you and you don't have the same rights as other people.
Why is Sweden among the most egalitarian societies, or the Scandinavian societies in general? Why?
Well, I would say all of them are sort of in the same category: Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland to a certain extent. The income differences between groups is much smaller, much less extreme. At least until very recently, their immigration policies were much more liberal and much more welcoming. For instance, I'm a Swedish citizen, and when I migrated to Sweden the first time, I was sent to school by the Swedish government to learn Swedish and paid to do that. I got a salary to learn Swedish 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 8 months until I was fluent in the language. There are very few, I don't know of any other country that has a policy like that for immigrants. It's issues of that type. Why Scandinavia is so, and to go further, in terms of the oppression of women, or the proportion of women in the Riksdag, it's about 45%. It's very high. It's almost at par with men. Why Scandinavia is so egalitarian, we don't know. I mean, that's a very complicated question, but the fact is that they are relatively, compared to Saudi Arabia or the United States or Great Britain or Pakistan, extremely egalitarian countries.
How would you like to see your theory, which seems quite valid, and applying it What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't do policy. I do not make policy recommendations. I try to stay away from that for two reasons. One, I think it's really not wise to implement policy until we really fundamentally understand the nature of the problem. And we're just in the middle of that.
What about the boys on the street that are getting stopped in prison? Shouldn't we be forming some sort of normative governance?
But that's not my role as a scientist. My role as a scientist is to try to analyze situations, not go out and engage in political advocacy. And I think that kind of advocacy would get in the way of my relatively objective way of examining these phenomena. So I try to stand back from the political fray and just think about problems rather than engaged in active. I did that. I had an activist phase in my life, and now I'm sort of stepping back from that and trying to understand what I was doing better. Okay.
Thank you.
That are utilizing this theory that you have to promote better success of their students, to connect to the HE and the HA in relevance to promote success in the university or in learning?
I don't know of any school which has implemented this or taken part in these findings and see what the policy implications might be. The theory is still too young and too controversial to do that. And I, like I said before, wouldn't really feel comfortable in engaging in policy recommendations with this. I really just want to try to understand the phenomena better.
About white students claiming they're not being granted admission to university because of their ethnicity?
Well, that's because to some extent there is a zero-sum relationship between with regards to places at the university. There's only a finite number of slots. And so if efforts are made to increase the representation of traditionally underrepresented groups like Latinos and Asians, not Asians so much, but Latinos and African Americans, then that's necessarily going to come up with fewer places for white students. So I understand very well the reason for the students' suit and complaint about reverse discrimination. However, if you were to do a survey in the United States and ask people right now, who is more discriminated against? Latinos and African Americans on the one hand, or European Americans on the other. And you ask this of European American populations, what do you think the answer would be? Who is more discriminated against, whites or minorities? Whites would say whites are more discriminated against. Okay? They understand and process changes in the relationship between dominant and subordinate groups as loss of relative power. And it is a loss of relative power, which they react to by thinking that now they're in the minority position. They're being subjugated to oppression. And affirmative action is seen as one policy in this direction, which is why I would predict that it's not going to last. Affirmative action simply cannot be politically sustained.
Do you think that stereotype and prejudice is going to become innate? For example, for the 44 police officers, they were being racist and they were being encouraged to be racist. So I'm not sure, but I feel like that might be an adaptive behavior. So over years, do you think it's
Well, they're certainly adapting, we would argue, adapting to the social environment of their police departments, where that kind of very manly, brutal forms of treatment of subordinates is smiled upon, is rewarded. That's what's considered good policing in some circles. So in that sense, yes, they're doing what is in their long-range interest. Not to be caught on film shooting an unarmed suspect. That's sort of going overboard, right? It would be hard to justify that. But where there's no film to decide, to help us decide who was right and who was wrong, most of the time they're going to win the argument. right? The police officer will be believed and the citizen won't.
Your data there are very clear in terms of when the ha go into a he institution or he into a ha institution, that there's an incongruency. Have you looked at it from the other side, or does the data show anything about where somebody, say from a ha background, enters into a he institution and actually has an impact on the changing that he institution?
That
to
we
ha
haven't
values?
looked at the impact on the institution itself if you have ha's in it. What we have looked at in that study I showed you data from is that ha people in he institutions or ha students in he majors don't do very well. Okay? And we would argue because of the number of these factors we've been talking about here. But the degree to which they can actually change the nature of the institution, that's another question. And we don't have a good answer for that. It hasn't been studied that well. But I would suggest, nonetheless, that this tendency towards he-ness and ha-ness are endemic to human nature. He-ness is not a bad and evil thing. It's sometimes necessary and useful under certain circumstances, as when you're involved in war against another group. You want a lot of he's around, and you want them to be particularly brutal. When in times of peace, they become a problem. So it's not as if we're trying to eliminate ha-ness or he-ness forever. We're just trying to see what the balance between these two forces is.
Given that social dominance orientation and to a much greater extent racism are taboos and things that people wouldn't necessarily freely admit to believing in, how do you go about measuring those types of ideologies?
Oh, one of the major methodological breakthroughs that social psychology has had in the last 15 to 20 years is use of implicit measurement of attitudes, so that we can. There's a test called the implicit association test, developed by one of my colleagues at Harvard, Mahzreen Banaji. And what this test does is look at the speed with which subjects can associate good things with black people and bad things with white people, and vice versa. How long it takes them to respond or make those associations. And what the data show is it's much more, significantly more difficult for citizens, even African American citizens, to associate pictures of black people or the name black or African American with positive words, and much easier to associate European Americans with positive words, and much easier to associate African Americans with negative words, and more difficult to associate European American with associated words. Even if you know what the test is trying to do, and you're trying to make these associations as quickly as possible, the more your negative attitudes or xenophobic attitudes are, the more it shows up in these test scores. So it's a way to get around people's natural tendency to give socially desirable responses. And there are lots of tests like that social psychologists have developed in the last 15 years or so to get at people's implicit inside attitudes.
How national identity plays in this, like if you know anything about any findings on how the stronger national identity correlates more with a stronger like social dominance theory within a nation, or do you know anything about that? I'm just curious.
Well, there is I'm going to answer the question I understood, maybe not your question. There is evidence showing in certain groups an association between national identification and social dominance orientation. But that depends upon the power of the ethnic group. So in the United States, for example, we find positive associations between patriotic and nationalist pro-American feelings and levels of SDO among white respondents, but the opposite among black respondents. So it depends upon where you are in the social hierarchy.
I wonder, is there any role for family as a social institution for racial problems or discrimination as such?
That's a tricky question. yes, families have a lot to do with socializing children, but we're going to ask the question, well, what is it that's going to determine how families are going to socialize children, either ha and he directions, which depends upon a number of complex factors. So we can't simply say, well, we'll turn it over to families to get rid of discrimination, because that's certainly not going to work if half the families in the country have discriminatory values to begin with. They're simply going to reproduce themselves.